Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good evening for those who are in Beijing. In case of our and Long, who has been invited for today's webinar. Today's webinar will be presented by Chen Long. Chen Long is the co-founder of Plenum, think tank which covers Chinese politics and the economy. He is a graduate of the University of Beijing, and in the past he has worked with Arthur Kroeber at Dragonomics, then later Gavical, and now he is at the full-time with Plenum. And the theme of our presentation today will be China versus US, will be the Chinese answer to the US offensive. So China versus US is more or less the universe in which we are moving today. And of course, the idea is to see what are the impacts of the economic dispute, or I would say simply the dispute which goes far beyond the economic field between China and the United States. Some say that we are about to embark in a new sort of Cold War. I would dispute that sort of perception. It's not a zero-sum game that exists between China and the US like we had in the past last century between the US and the late Soviet Union. China and the US have a very integrated economies, and many value chains start in the US and are completed in China and vice versa. So there is a very fruitful relationship in the economic and commercial field between China and the US. So I would dispute the fact that their dispute is sort of a zero-sum game. And it's much more centered in the technological and high-tech field, which has to do as the future of the functioning of the economy will be largely centered on high tech. So the idea is that Cheng will make his presentation, will probably present a few data on screen about what he's presenting. And then Claudia Trevisan, Director General of the Executive Director of CEBC, Brazil-China Business Council, will make some comments and the presentation in a debate with Chen. Claudia Trevisan was working for the newspaper Estado de São Paulo and has been posted in China for 6 years and then in Washington for 6 years. So perhaps she is in the much better position the China-US dispute because she has been able to observe the facts from Beijing, from a Beijing standpoint, and from a Washington standpoint. Well, I would not take your time anymore, and I will pass the floor to Chen Long. Chen, you're most welcome. Thank you for your acceptance of our invitation, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Before I pass the floor, I would remind that those who are watching the webinar, they can eventually make some questions through the Q&A mechanism. Well, Chen, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you, Claudia, for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to have this opportunity to speak at CEBC, talk to new friends as well as some old friends, but I saw some people in the attendees are like people I've known for quite a few years. And it's a pleasure to meet all of you again virtually. And good morning. So my presentation today will be about how Beijing tackles the economic and political challenge. Let me click share screen. Yep. Yep. So how Beijing tackles economic and political challenge. So I will start from with a brief introduction about Platinum, because as the ambassador just introduced, I spent 6 years working at GAVCO before founding Platinum last fall. It's an independent research firm. We dedicated to China macro policies, politics, as well as international relations. So it's a team of native Chinese analysts with extensive backgrounds in international organizations. And we're like spread across the world. And we are be very pleased to offer you a trial if you're interested in our research. So my presentation today will really be divided into 3 parts. First is how China recovers from the COVID-19 shock from the economic perspective, and then how China is responding and will continue to respond to the US offensive. And the last part is what's going to happen after November the 3rd when the US presidential election happens. So obviously, I mean, this COVID-19 shock is unprecedented. Every country in the world is suffering massively, and China obviously was the first major country that had this pain. And in Q1, the GDP, the economy was shrinking. GDP fell by over 6%, 6.8% year on year. This is the first quarterly decline in 30 years. And but fortunately, after the lockdown has basically stopped the virus from spreading further, we had a pretty nice rebound in the second quarter, partly to do with the reopening of the economy, and partly to do with the fact that the government doubles down on some economic policies, particularly on investment. So you can see from the right-hand chart that investment is bouncing back much more sharply than consumption in the second quarter. And regarding specific policies, there are several things China did. First, PBOC started cutting interest rates in Q1, and in total it cut interest rate by about 30 bips and offered cheaper funds to the economy. On the other hand, Beijing planned much bigger fiscal deficit. Right. So on budget, Ministry of Finance said they're going to expand the budget from a little bit around 3% to nearly 4%. But we add up all the special purpose government bonds, as well as the transfer of payments from previous years, the actual fiscal deficit could be as large as 16% based on my estimates. And this will be much bigger than previous years when even if like the surplus was, the fiscal deficit was already quite large, already been over 10% for quite a few years. This is still unprecedented. And compare with 2009, the global financial crisis is still much bigger. In the post-GFC, the total fiscal deficit was probably about 10%, while this time it's going to be about 16%. So it's a much bigger response from a fiscal perspective. But from a monetary perspective, actually, the response so far in China has been relatively restrained and is smaller than itself in the post-GFC, as well as compared with other countries, right? So after 2008 financial crisis, China let credit growth explode, and this so-called 4 trillion come from a combination of fiscal and monetary stimulus. And China's M2 growth surged from 15% over 30% in a matter of few months. And if you look at other major economies in post-GFC, in the US, there was a little bit of acceleration of M2 growth, the black line. But in Eurozone, it actually was a deceleration. In Japan, nothing really happened. Well, this time, in Eurozone, it is also accelerating, the gray line. In Japan, M2 growth was accelerating. In the US, we are seeing unprecedented growth of M2 in the last few months, from a little bit over 5% to over 20%. So the monetary response from the United States this time is much bigger than any other country in the world. And this can also be seen, I mean, not just from the M2 growth, but also from policy rates. I'm putting together a few major countries, not just from the developed markets, but also from emerging markets. So you see, even India and South Korea, the scale of rate cuts is much bigger than what the PBOC did, which was basically about 30 bips if you look at the red line. And the reason why the monetary response in China has been so far restrained is that China's credit growth has been very fast over the past 12 years, right? In the post-2008 GFC response, total credit growth surged from 15% to 35%. And we have a couple of later episodes of stimulus in 2012-13 and 2015-16. right? And as a consequence, the total debt to GDP in China surged from a little bit less than 150% in 2008 to a little bit over 250% by the end of 2019. And even that was after a 3-year so-called deleveraging campaign from Beijing that basically kept total debt to GDP unchanged for 3 years. But this year, we're going to surge massively, and I think total debt to GDP will rise by at least 30 percentage point this year, which is even bigger than the increase of debt in 2009, just because the base is much bigger, even though the growth rate is much smaller. And to be specific in terms of sectors, we have a few sectors really leading the economy from the recovery, in the recovery. One is properties. I mean, as always, I mean, after GFC, there was a big surge. And in 2011, 2015, we all have property sales start to surge massively from negative territory to very high double digits. That's the red line. And followed by the surge of construction activities, the green line. So we're seeing the same thing this year. It fell massively in the first quarter and rebounded very sharply in the second quarter. And the other one is the production and sales of cars. I mean, China is the largest car manufacturing and car market in the world. It sells about 25 million cars every year, and it's very important for the economy. It accounts for nearly 10% of GDP if you look at all the upstream, downstream industries together. And this time, thanks to a lot of subsidies launched by local governments, we're seeing a big surge of car sales as well as car productions in the last couple of months. And two other engines of this recovery or infrastructure spending, which had to do with large fiscal deficit because local governments were allowed to issue a lot of special purpose bonds, and the infrastructure spending started to rebound much faster than the rest of the investment components. And this has caused heavy machinery like trucks, excavators. These sales of this stuff are really growing very fast. The production of excavators were growing at 60% year on year in the last month or so. And that's really fast. It's because of the construction demand. And the other one was integrated circuits with semiconductors. And it's thanks to the export controls from the US and from the US allies. I mean, China doubled down on its own industrial policy, and semiconductor was at the center of this domestic industrial policy, right? And one surprising thing, apart from all these domestic policies, right, subsidies on cars, subsidies easing on housing, domestic rate cuts, bigger fiscal deficit, is that Chinese exports were doing much better than anybody expected. If you ask myself 4 months ago what I think about Chinese exports, I would say, when the rest of the world all locked down, I mean, Chinese export cannot do well. But maybe fortunately, I mean, I was wrong. I mean, Chinese export was doing much better than its peers in Asia, because usually we look at China's export together with South Korea and Taiwan, they move in the same direction. But this time, China significantly outperformed South Korea and Taiwan, and also significantly outperformed the rest of the world. And this is mainly because, one, China is able to sell much needed products like work from home gears, such as laptops, tablets, as well as a lot of medical gears. And this really helped support Chinese export growth. And also China has a pretty diverse industrial base, a very diverse manufacturing sector. That basically means when the rest of the world is locked down, the Chinese factories are the only ones stay open and can maintain enough supply to the rest of the world, right? So we finished about all the bright spots about the recovery, and there are two concerns about the recovery so far. One, we mentioned a little bit in the first slide that Chinese consumption is still lagging. And the main reason is household income is lagging. I think this is a really much better indicator than unemployment data, because unemployment, sometimes you get non-paid leave. These people don't count into unemployed, but they don't really make money. So we look at household income growth as a much better depiction about the labor market. And it's still very weak. It's only growing at about 4% in nominal terms, and still much lower than the pre-COVID level. And consumption is even weaker, right? And even within consumption, you see the consumer goods have almost recovered to flat year on year. Of course, it's still far from the 10% growth in pre-COVID era. But if you look at restaurants, the catering sector is still down double-digit year-on-year basis last month. Because a lot of people are still not comfortable about eating out. And this can be seen from some indicators. I mean, my favorite indicator is the subway passenger volume in China. We look at 30 cities and their daily traffic volume. In 12 cities in the north and 18 cities in the south and the national level. And you can see in the south of China, life is almost normal, right? It's 100% of the level of January 20th before the Wuhan lockdown. But in the northern part of the country, I mean, still just 85%, and it's much slower even from the very beginning, right? And especially when we had the Beijing second wave hit in June, the subway passenger volume fell sharply, right? And you look at cross-country traffic, it's still even worse, right? The passenger volume, like we put together air travel, railway, highway, canals. I mean, the actual passenger volume cross-country is still just about half of the level pre-COVID, because a lot of the business trips are still canceled. The tourism travels are also much lower than it used to be, right? So with a lot of recovery, a lot of lives are normalized, but cross-country is still not 100%, right? So the next part is the answer to the U.S. offensive. I mean, of course, that's a key part of the today's world, and how China is really going to answer that. I think one thing is we have seen Beijing's strategy has been pretty clear in the last few months, that Beijing tries to separate trade talks from diplomatic spats and technological frictions, right? I call this kind of strategy a compartmentalization, right? You have different people in charge of different matters. On diplomatic stuff, you have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. On top of it, when you have the trade matters, you have the Central Office of Economic Finance, led by Vice Premier Liu He, and he's leading that. And on technology, basically you have MIT and a few other ministries altogether. And they're using very different tactics. And part of it is Beijing is very restrained from retaliating directly against American companies, because it realized very well that the economy is still on the way of recovery, and it doesn't want to curb foreign investments in China, which would hurt Chinese growth at the end, right? So if you guys are familiar with the development of U.S.-China frictions in the last couple of years, you should probably know that there was a phrase the so-called unreliable list that Beijing said it was about to launch about last year this time, or even earlier, I think last summer, right? Because that's going to be in direct retaliation to what Washington did to Chinese companies like ZTE and Huawei. But so far, over a year later, I mean, there's still no news or no sign at all that Beijing is going to release this unreliable list at all. And actually, so far, the only company that Beijing has retaliated against so far is Lockheed Martin, basically because of the weapon sales to Taiwan. But Lockheed has almost zero business in China, so it is very targeted. It's after very well calculation that it's also very symbolic. So I think for Beijing, the priority so far is still the economy, and at the same time, it is trying very hard to make sure companies from other parts of the world are still investing in China. So in terms of this, Beijing has cut import tariffs, has cut the length of the so-called negative list to make it much easier for certain industries to invest in China. Financial opening is making much bigger progress, as well as the opening of the financial market to foreign investors. So that's a lot of what it's doing, and I think this is basically what the deal cycle is about. It's also it's not just about closing doors and relying on the domestic economy, but it's really also about further opening up and to make sure China still benefits from the globalization trend. And I would want to elaborate a little bit more on the so-called deal cycle, because it's a very popular slogan in the last couple of months. And actually, when the phrase deal cycle was first mentioned, it got no attention at all. It was first mentioned by President Xi in a meeting he had during the National People's Congress in late May. I mean, he visited a provincial delegate, and he mentioned, we should probably do the dual cycle thing, and it's really important. And dual cycle referring to domestic cycle as well as international cycle. But the phrase suddenly got a lot more attention in July when a lot of the party newspaper and the government officials, state think tanks start to mention that. And in one of the Politburo meeting, President Xi included with other Politburo Standing Committee members, he did mention explicitly about the importance of dual cycle. And he did say in the dual cycle, the so-called domestic cycle should be the main body, and the international cycle is also very important. But when he first mentioned domestic cycle was the main body in the July Politburo meeting, people's first reaction was, oh, that means China is going to look inward, right? And so we were also trying to scratch our head about what that really means. And I look at this chart on the left-hand side. So they say, you know what, China, at the time I saw some interpretation, and they say China is too dependent on foreign trade, and then China should cut that dependence and more dependent on domestic demand. And I was looking at this chart, I would say that was bullshit, right? Maybe you could say China was very heavily dependent on export demand in 2008, because that was when, you get the red line, about 35%, total export was 35% of China's GDP, was as high as Germany, was one of the highest in the world. But since 2008, export as a share of GDP has declined constantly from 35% to now just 17%. And it's not only a lot lower than Germany today, but even lower than France. And it's only as much as how much the UK is dependent on the rest of the world. And you look at other major countries, I mean, China is really ranking in the middle, right? So it's very hard to argue that China today, the economy, still very dependent on foreign trade. I mean, it actually has much less dependent on foreign trade. So you could say, I think a much more correct version of this main body thing is domestic cycle has been the main body for at least 12 years. And look at other these sectors, percentage of sales developed for export in top 10 industries in China, all of them, the share has declined, right, over the past 10 years. So China today, it is an economy basically dependent on, it is still the largest exporter in the world, but its importance in the economy has declined quite dramatically in the last 12 years or so, right? But I do think in terms of imports, that's probably what the so-called domestic cycle can mean something, because President Xi did say that, you know, we are facing export controls from certain developed economies. He didn't raise the name of the United States, but we all know that's what he means. So why is that? Because China imports over $300 billion of semiconductors every year. That's even larger than China's oil imports, right? And if, let's say, I mean, the TSMC, I mean, the so-called foreign direct product rule is going to be effective next Monday. And after that, any semiconductor manufacturer using US technology or equipment will not be able to sell to Huawei. And Huawei is China's largest end user of semiconductors. And it is widely expected that these sanctions, export controls, will be extended to other semiconductor designers and manufacturers in China, right? So that means if China still wants to develop this industry, there's no way it can still import $300 billion. And the rate has to slow down, has to decline from here. And the other one is Chinese tourist spending. I mean, Chinese tourists spend about $250 billion a year, shopping, traveling, eating, drinking abroad. And that's more than the Americans and Germans combined, who are the second and third largest tourist spending countries in the world, right? And this year, obviously, this will decline a lot because international travel is not going to happen at all. And I think the spending will fall from 250 billion to less than 100 billion. So there's a 150 billion gap, and who is going to fill in that gap? So a lot of the domestic retailers are going to open up duty-free stores in the cities, and they're going to want to seize this $150 billion demand from Chinese consumers. But still, I think, there's no way China can close the door today. I mean, to make sure to only dependent on the domestic cycle, and the international cycle will only be more important because on certain stuff, especially commodities, China is only importing more commodities every year. I'm showing this in quantity items of China's imports of crude oil, copper, iron ore, and coal. So for all of them, basically China is importing much more in terms of quantity every year than the previous year. And if you look at oil in particular, China is importing more than the US and India combined, who are the second and third largest importers of oil in the world. And it will not be too long when China is going to import more than the US, Japan, and India combined. So we're the number 2, number 3, number 4. So China is extremely dependent on foreign supply of commodities, and this is something just inevitable, right? So I think in terms of deal cycle, we can be a little bit assured. And actually, I think over the last couple of weeks, there has been a quite dramatic shift in the official interpretation of what that means. So President Xi, in one of his meetings a couple of weeks ago with leading domestic scholars, he referred to the data such as this one. Chinese export as share of GDP has declined massively over the past decade, and net export as a share of GDP also declined from 10% to just 1%. So he also agreed that domestic cycle has already been the main body for 12 years. And he's basically saying, we're just going to keep doing in that direction. And in saying that, I think he's hinting that we're not going to be, the policy will not make a big dramatic shift to be more inward looking. Actually, reform and open up is still important. And actually just yesterday, Vice Premier Hu Chunhua, who is in charge of the foreign investment, had a meeting with the leading business chambers in China. I mean, a few of people probably we are familiar with. I mean, the heads of Euro Chamber, AmCham, Canadian chambers, they all went. I guess there might be some Brazilian entrepreneurs at the meeting as well. So he spent 2.5 hours at the meeting, basically listening to the complaints and suggestions from foreign business. So, and Beijing scrapped the GDP growth target this year, but a different target was raised, the so-called 6 stabilizations. And one of the 6 stabilization is to stabilize foreign investment. So this is extremely important for China. And this is so important because China's foreign direct investment actually slowed from the peak already in the last 2 years, right? So annually, we're now making about, China is attracting about 30 to 40 billion a year foreign investment. Or at the peak in the past decade, the number is double, right? So it is realizing the trend is not looking very good, and is trying very hard to stabilize this foreign investment to stop that from falling further. But the good news is, I think China is doing very well in terms of the financial opening. A lot of the banks, brokers have been allowed to solely own the joint ventures or to take majority stakes. And the foreign ownership of Chinese bonds of equities also increased dramatically in the last few years. And this opening up the financial sector is only going to accelerate in the next few years. So last, I want to talk a little bit about beyond November. So what China is going to do after November. I think now the strategy is clear. I mean, China is not responding very much because it's waiting for the election. If Biden wins, I mean, I think there's still a lot of people in Beijing hoping that there could be a new chance to talk with Biden and to talk with his team, because it's not just the president matters, but also the people around the president matters. And when these folks get into the office and they need to figure out the new China strategy, then they have to talk to the Chinese counterparts first. And so that before that happens, I think Beijing will do very little retaliations unless there's like a military, or like if, let's say, Taiwan declares independence, I mean, Beijing will retaliate very strongly. But in absence of such an extreme event, I think Beijing's retaliation will be relatively moderate. And we have to be a little bit careful about something is going to happen in the next few weeks. We saw the early stage for US to sanction Hong Kong financial institutions is already started. September 7th was the early stage. And from now to next September, Washington could announce the sanction at any time. Next Monday, that's the beginning of the foreign direct product rule. So TSMC, as well as other semiconductor manufacturers, would now be able to supply for Huawei. September 15th was the so-called Washington going to give a definition of the transact with TikTok, and the Commerce Department will issue guidelines to define that in September 20th. So there's still a lot of things going to happen, and probably we're going to see some sanctions about related to Xinjiang as well. But I think Beijing's overall response to the events in the next couple of months will be muted. It will just stay there, stay calm, wait for November 3rd. And I think Beijing would really hope Biden to win this time, because that would make things much easier. But even if Trump wins, I think there's still a chance for dialing back some of the previous hawkishness, because very few people in the administration will stay for 8 years. For example, the USTR usually only stay for 4 years. And it's also very rare for Secretary of State stay for 2 terms. And even for his advisors like Navarro and other guys in national security advisors, they're also very unlikely to stay for 8 years. I think there is a chance for Beijing to find opportunity to talk to either Biden or Trump in the next year or so, try to dial back a little bit from this year's acceleration of deterioration of relationship. Yep. I guess I will stop here, and I will leave the floor for Claudia and our audience for some questions. You're muted. Claudia, you're muted.
Yeah, thank you so much, Long, for this dense presentation and very informative. I'd like to remind our audience that you can make questions using the Q&A tool of Zoom, which is at the bottom of the page. And I will raise some questions to Long, and then we will open for your questions. Long, one of your slides that you passed very quickly showed that the phase 1 trade deal between the US and China will not reach its goals this year. This trade deal that was closed in January says that China should buy $200 billion more in imports from the US from the baseline of 2017. And in Brazil, there was a big concern that the trade deal would lead to a very high increase of agricultural products purchases from China in the US, which could be detrimental for Brazilian exports. This has not happened this year. I'd like to know, what do you expect for next year? Do you believe that China will be able to fulfill the phase 1 agreement? And if yes, could we expect a reduction in the demand for Brazilian products?
Right, thank you, Claudia. I think I'm going to share my screen again so I can show better about the execution of the trade deal. I think that's what Claudia referred to is this chart on the left-hand side. So according to the agreement, that's what China is supposed to buy from the US in the last few years. And the black line is goods and services, and the red line is goods. And I think, to be honest, even from the very beginning, I was extremely skeptical about the execution of this deal, because this is such an explosion of that. And some of the part will be easier because some imports, especially the agricultural part, are basically done by Chinese state-owned enterprises. Basically, it's COFCO and a few other guys, they were going to import soybeans, porks, and from the United States. And this is more or less a state order. But for others, like manufacturing goods, as well as service, because a big part of the service, actually most of the majority of the service is really tourism, right? And the Chinese government can hardly dictate how many Chinese tourists go to the United States and how much they pay for it, right? And especially after the COVID-19 pandemic, I mean, the international travel is basically frozen. And I think it's very hard for the international travel to normalize before 2022. I mean, that's my personal view, right? So if I'm right, I think the service part will not be executed at all. And the only part is still possible, I think, is the agricultural part. I mean, the right-hand chart shows some of the Chinese purchase of producers from the US. And this is the market year of 2019 to 20, compared with the market year 2016-17, and the market year 2018 to 19, right? So it is for beef, pork, this has increased by 7-fold or 9-fold, and this is only by mid-July, right? And even compared with some other goods like corn, cotton, they all increased by over 100%. I mean, soybean was the only thing that was lagging, but the purchase demand has increased dramatically in the last few weeks. So I think on that front, China can probably reach the agreement. But for the others, I mean, as well as energy, it's also very difficult because oil price is still a lot lower than it was a year ago. So that means, and all the major oil producers are cutting supplies. So it makes very little sense for China to import a lot more from the United States. And even if China does import a little bit more, in value terms, it's very hard to match what is said in the January agreement. So I think at the end of the day, the purchase part of the deal will not be met. But let's not forget that there are also a lot of the non-purchase related stuff in the agreement, like the opening up the financial sector, opening up certain non-financial sector, scrap some tariffs. And I think China on those fronts are still busy executing. And so far, even the American counterparts are quite satisfied with that. And I think in terms of impact on Brazil, I don't think Brazilian firms should be very much worried about that. Because even if with China's massive imports of agricultural goods from the US this year, I just checked before the meeting, the Chinese import from Brazil is also up a lot this year. And both in terms of soybean and iron ore, even when China imports a lot more American soybean, its demand for soybeans from Brazil is still up because China's like 3/4 of Chinese soybean consumption comes from abroad. So this is very huge, and China's meat consumption is only rising every day, every month, every year. And to feed all these animals, you just need a lot more beans, and China doesn't produce that much, right? So the gap is getting wider and wider every year. And I think for Brazil, it's just going to be a very big market. It's not going to be affected very much.
Thank you, Long. And it's clear that China is answering the US offensive with more reform and more opening up, increase its integration to the world to avoid being isolated. But a lot of the reforms seem to be focused on the financial sector. Is this perception right? And if yes, why the financial sector, and which other sectors do you think will see similar reforms?
In China?
In China.
I think, it really depends on what you think about reforms, because I think the financial sector obviously is reforming relatively fast, opening up relatively fast. And I think also there have been some pilot programs in China. For example, they're making Hainan Island in the southern part of China a big free port. And they're going to copy the policies in Hong Kong and Macau to make like it's duty-free. The whole province, whole island will be duty-free, and the tax rates for individuals will be very low, and be very easy for foreign airlines, for even foreign telecom companies to set up foundations in the Hainan free port. Right? So I think it's probably it's a little bit less about sectors, but more about regions or the pilot programs China is trying to push forward with.
And Chen, how do you expect Chinese investments abroad to behave after coronavirus? China was became a very important investor in the world, and in Brazil included. What is your outlook for that?
I think
this is a question from the audience already.
Right, that's great. I think I'm going to show the slides again because I do have one of these charts showing it. Right. So this is the Chinese investment abroad. So I use a few different indicators to show that, but all of them basically saying the same story, right? China's outbound direct investment peaked in 2016, and since then have declined a little bit every year or so. I mean, now, every quarter the spending is about 25 billion. Every year, China invests about 80 to 100 billion abroad. And this is lower than the peak when each quarter China invests about 35 to 40 billion, annualized about 150 billion. And that's really because China cracked down on some of the big private investors such as HNA, Hainan Airline, Wanda, and a few other investors like Anbang. I mean, remember there's a time 2015, 17, they were busy buying hotels, buying movie theaters, football clubs. You see, every major league in Europe has Chinese investors in 2015, 16. And then after that, Beijing started to crack down on those foreign investments because a lot of that was financed by domestic debt. And they don't want them to accumulate debt in China and invest abroad. And at some point, maybe this money came from corruption, and when they exchange foreign passport, they just leave the country, right? And they left the Chinese banks with a lot of bad debt. So that's what the Beijing was deeply worried about. So there was a crackdown in 2016, 17. Since then, foreign investment have cracked down. But apart from these, I mean, also there's another reason is it's much more difficult for Chinese investments to invest abroad. I mean, if you want to make direct investment, right? Because now America, you have CFIUS, basically screening Chinese investments very, very carefully. It's very hard for Chinese companies to invest in the high-tech sectors in the US. And in Europe, there are similar initiatives. In Japan, it's also very difficult. So I think not just like China is cracking down some of the foreign investment, but in the other parts of the world, I mean, they also be a little bit more careful about receiving Chinese investment. And I heard even in Brazil, I think there is a discussion about whether there should be some mechanism set up to safeguard the setting of the Brazilian assets. So I think this is an environment very different from 10 years ago, that foreign investment is no longer 100% welcome. Some of them is still welcomed, but remember there was a time foreign investment was recognized as good in every country in the world, but unfortunately it's no longer that case today. So I think not so much to do with pandemic, but just with underlying trend, I think it's very hard for Chinese ODI to reach the peak in the next few years.
Thank you, Long. Another question from the audience. It's Xi Jinping said recently that China would be willing to open the services market to foreign companies. How likely is this, and how it can happen?
I think the opening is going to happen. I think it's very likely to happen. And I think you raised a very good question about how deep can be. And this is really the key, because you could say I had a similar discussion with some European banks and financial institutions a few months ago, and their complaint is they said, okay, now we can own the majority share of a JV of a financial institution in China. We can even own 100%. But you know what? We still need approval from CBIRC, the Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission, and the approval takes 18 months at least. So it's really slow, right? So now, yeah, it is more open. The market access has been solved, but it's not really about open. So I think you raised a very good question, and for me, it's hard for me to say for sure. How deep can it be? And we can really see from the evidence whether China is going to accelerate approval process rather than just offer market access.
Another question is about the US-China conflict rivalry. The Global Times said last week that China could gradually cut its holdings of US Treasury bonds. China is the second largest holder of Treasury bonds. Is this likely? Is this possible?
Well, Global Times know nothing about the economy. I mean, it's the rule 101 you should know. And the Global Times know nothing about international finance. It's not impossible, because China's holding of US Treasury, China's total foreign reserve was 4 trillion in early 2014. And now it's 3.1 trillion. And we all knew what happened in between, right? Because renminbi was at a crisis in 2015, 16. There was very strong depreciation pressure, and PBOC tried to fight against the depreciation by selling dollar reserves. And by selling the dollar reserves, it has to unload a lot of US treasuries, right? So it could happen if we have another wave of renminbi depreciation and the PBOC wants to intervene. But if that doesn't happen, let's say China's foreign reserve stays at 3.1 trillion US dollars, at least today. And if China says, okay, we're going to cut treasury holdings. So then the next question, okay, what will it buy, right? Will it buy Japanese government bond, JGB, at 0 interest rate? Will it buy German bond at the minus of 50 bips? Right? I think none of these likelihoods are very viable options, right? So yeah, it could, but there's really no big alternative because China has over $1 trillion US dollar assets in US treasuries. And simply no other market in the world is deep enough to take these large investments, right? So I think the possibility of that is extremely low. And yeah, it could gradually cut. I mean, how much is gradual? We said $10 a day. And that's also very gradual, but nobody in the financial market should care.
Another question: do you think the financial sector opening in China has the ability to tilt back the overall balance of American business regarding China to a more accommodating position, a more favorable position towards China?
I think it's, probably not. I think it takes a while. The sector opening is not, it's not that big enough for American business, but I think it's better than, just better than not doing it, right? Still, I mean, China is much more dependent on the US than America depends on China. And this is not going to change overnight. It's not going to change in a few years. But I do think the strategy for China is, there are a lot of people talking about decoupling, right? Trump wants decoupling. Some of his advisors want decoupling. And if Trump wants decoupling, the most sensible thing Beijing should want is to avoid that from happening. And how to avoid decoupling from happening? You just continue to open up your market. You let more American businesses come in, and then the decoupling will not happen at all. Right. So even if a little bit doesn't work, but as things accumulate, it will have a relatively positive impact.
And another question touched the issue of the semiconductors. You show that China is extremely dependent on the imports of semiconductors. It's the largest item on Chinese imports. How vulnerable is China if the US decides to expand the crackdown and increase the export controls on semiconductors to China? What can happen in China?
It is very vulnerable. Because the US can do, there are several things the US can do. Because China imports a lot of semiconductors from a few countries, right? United States, South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. And these are the 4 major suppliers of semiconductors for China. And for Taiwan and Korea, what they do is, they have the manufacturing capability, right? Samsung Hynix is one of the largest manufacturers of semiconductors, and TSMC, of course, is the world's largest, and they manufacturing for everybody, right? And now we have TSMC, basically neither TSMC nor Samsung Hynix is going to be able to manufacturing for the chips designed by Huawei. Huawei's designing ability is very strong. It's one of the world's leading, but it doesn't have the manufacturing capacity, right? Because only Taiwan and South Korea have the world's leading level. China has SMIC, which is also a very large manufacturer, but it is lagging. Its technology is lagging South Korea and Taiwan by 8 to 7 years. So it takes a long while, and the equipment SMIC, TSMC, and Samsung Hynix have to all be used is some equipment from Applied Materials and Lam Research. These 2 are American firms, right? So Americans, they don't directly manufacture semiconductors, the chips, but they make the equipment that make the chips, right? And that's really on the upper level of the industry. So if the Trump administration said, what, Applied Material Lam Research can no longer sell to any Chinese company, and whoever is using Lam Research or Applied Material cannot sell to a Chinese company either, right? Or we're going to cut your supplies. So there's going to be a big hit on the Chinese end users, because China is the largest smartphone producer in the world. All the large brands except Apple and Samsung, all in China, right? the Huawei, the Oppo, Vivo, Xiaomi, a lot of them. And they combined have like probably 50% of market share in the world. So if that is cut, so they will have no supply. But this is also going to have a very adverse impact on applied material and lab research because the Chinese are the biggest customers, right? So they will have no customers. They have a little bit, but they will have big decline in revenue. So their shareholders may not be very happy to see that happen.
And two questions touch the strategy, the dual cycle strategy. Some people call dual circulation strategy. One asks you to elaborate a little bit more on this strategy. And another one asks if this strategy is really new or it is the same thing that Beijing is doing with a new name.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question. As I said, I don't think it's, I mean, from the macro perspective, it's not new, right? So domestic cycle, the dual cycle and then the foreign centers is domestic cycle should be the main body and the national cycle is very important, right? So main body, I mean, it has been the main body for 12 years. So it's nothing new, right? If this dual cycle thing is mentioned in 2008, that would be very new. But today is 2020, it's not 2008. Right, and domestic economy still the economy is already much more dependent on domestic demand rather than external demand. So from that point, it's not new. But there's something new is about like certain industries, like semiconductors, like tourism spending. I think for these sectors there will be a big impact because China is using a lot of policies trying to shift those demand from the rest of the world to domestically. Not only because it wants to, but because it has no choice, right? Because you're facing the export controls. There's no way China can buy 300 billion semiconductors from the rest of the world every year in the future, right? So some of the demand, I think the red line will start to decline in the future, and this is kind of a combination of foreign interference as well as Chinese choice. But yeah, I don't really think dual cycle is kind of a strategy because it's really vague, right? It's like I remember it's very like a Belt and Road. Right? People ask me, what is Belt and Road? I mean, China is going to invest massively in Belt and Road. I mean, I never thought Belt and Road is anything new because before Belt and Road was first mentioned, I think 2015 or 16, China has been investing abroad for many years, and in that era. The key slogan was called "Going Out," because they say Chinese companies should start to go out, going out strategy. I mean, they're calling that. When President Xi started to mention Belt and Road, and they all say, "Oh, now we're no longer going out. We're implementing the Belt and Road strategy." So I really don't think either Belt and Road or a dual cycle is really new from a macro perspective, but they do have micro implications if you happen to be in certain countries, in certain industries. And that's going to affect their business.
Great, thank you. And as in other countries, Brazil is discussing the issue of 5G. And Brazil is suffering pressure from the United States to block Huawei. And Huawei has been in Brazil for 20 years, and it has at least 35%, or in the case of 4G, at least 40%, of the telecommunications equipments that are in Brazilian infrastructure. What if Brazil decides to block Huawei from its 5G network? What do you think would be the Chinese reaction and the consequence for Brazil from this decision?
Well, I think it also depends on how this denial is going to happen, right? I mean, there's one way of denial, it's the British way of denial. The British way is, okay, we're gonna give you 8 years for you, all the telecom providers to remove Huawei devices, because they already have Huawei devices in 4G, right? And some of the 5G also have. They say, it'll take years. And then British government saying, no, okay, I'll give you 8 years. And of course, it can be reversed if 2022, I mean, if Trump is gone and the Americans are no longer so enthusiastic about it, I think it could be totally fine to reverse it. So that's a way. And the other way, of course, is the American way. It's very straightforward. So, no Huawei, no ZTE, thank you. Brazil, I think certain kind of trade relationship might be harmed. I think China may start to, retaliate against. I mean, China will start looking, okay, who are the major proponents of denying Huawei in Brazil? Is there certain politicians or certain business arguing for it? And then I think China will want to retaliate in the constituency that support these politicians and depending on what businesses are in those constituencies.
Thank you. And there is also a question about the fiscal deficit in China, the increase of the fiscal deficit because of the Chinese response to the COVID. And do you expect the deficit to be tackled next year, or the fiscal situation will continue to deteriorate?
I think more or less it will continue to deteriorate. I mean, the deficit will continue to increase. And I think just because there's no way, because if China gives up on those fiscal spending, I mean, then the growth will start to slow down quite significantly. And for now, really the top priority is to generate growth. And it's not just in China, it's in the United States, in Japan, in Europe, because every country is now allowing record low interest rates, massive amount of government bonds, a massive amount of, I mean, you could call it helicopter money, because a lot of countries are giving cash directly to people, and all the money comes from borrowing, right? So I think government debt all over the world is going to make new high, and for most countries, this will not be a problem because interest rates are extremely low, and if interest rates are very low, you don't have to be worried about how to service the debt, right? But of course, the biggest problem will be inflation, right? If at some point this massive easing of monetary and fiscal policy start to generate inflation, then you have to start to tighten policies. And then when you tighten policies, I mean, the growth will start to slow down very dramatically. It'll be a very painful process. But for now, I think not really the top priority. I mean, the real problem will happen when inflation picks up.
And last question. Yeah, we are almost reaching 1 hour, and the question is related to the one of about the deficit. What are the main differences between the current government response to the crisis and the response after the 2008-2009 financial crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of had a few charts here showing the difference. Let me put it back, right? And you can see in 2008, I mean, China's M2 growth surged from 15% over 30%, right? So that is a much, much bigger monetary stimulus. And this time it only went up from 8% to 11%, that red line, right? So it's much more muted. Also in 2008, the scale of credit growth is also much higher, right? So that's the monetary, and this is the asset. So it's from 15 to 35, and this time I think it's only going to accelerate to about 13% from 10%, right? So the acceleration of credit is much more muted, but also the fiscal part is stronger, right? The fiscal deficit today is now over 15%, when 2008 is just 10%. So it is more dependent on fiscal this time rather than monetary, and also it's much more muted than the reaction from the rest of the world, right? You see Europe, Japan, their acceleration of M2 all faster than acceleration in China, right? So I think this time that's the difference. Because in 2008, China was the country that responding the most aggressively in the world, but this time it's no longer that case.
Okay, Qianlong, thank you so much for your participation, for accepting our invitation. It was a very, very rich discussion, I'm sure, and we received a lot of questions. And I'd like to thank you also, our audience, for the participation and the questions. And to say that our next webinar will be on September 24th at 10 a.m. with former American ambassador to Brazil, Thomas Shannon, with the moderation of the former Brazilian ambassador to the US, Sergio Amaral. Shane, would you like to say last words?
Yeah, I saw there are still more questions in the Q&A section, but we may not be able to cover all of them. If you are interested, feel free to drop me an email. And I think you already have the slides, and we can distribute my slides to the audience. And my contact information is in the slides. So email is chen@platinum.ai. So if you have questions, just reach out to me, and we'll be very happy to talk to you. And thanks again to Claudia and the ambassador for holding the event.
Great. Thank you so much, and good day for everybody. Bye.
Good day. Bye.